At 07:10 on the morning of June 6, 1944, First Sergeant Leonard Lamell crouched in a British landing craft 30 feet from the base of a 100-foot cliff at Point du Hoc, watching German soldiers throw grenades down at him from a position his commanders had called suicide. 24 years old, college graduate from Tennessee Wesleyan, zero combat experience. The Germans had 6 French 155mm guns positioned on Point du Hoc, capable of reaching 25,000 yards. Those guns could fire on Omaha Beach 7 miles to the east and Utah Beach 4 miles to the west. They could destroy the invasion fleet anchored offshore. A naval intelligence officer on Admiral Hall's staff had told Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder the assault was impossible. The officer explained it clearly. 3 old women with brooms could keep the Rangers from climbing that cliff. Rudder said his men could do it. The 2nd Ranger Battalion had been activated April 1, 1943, at Camp Forest, Tennessee. Major James Rudder took command on June 30, 1943. 34 years old, Texas A&M graduate, former high school football coach from Eden, Texas. He had taught school and coached before the war. He had never led men in combat. The Rangers trained through summer in Tennessee. The training was brutal. Of 500 volunteers, fewer than 300 completed the course. Men quit. Men were injured. Men were sent back to their original units. The Rangers who remained were the best physical specimens the Army could produce. They could march 30 miles with full pack. They could scale cliffs. They could fight hand to hand. But they had never been in combat. In September 1943, the battalion shipped to Fort Pierce, Florida, for amphibious training. They learned to land from small boats in heavy surf. They learned to move under fire. They learned that the ocean could kill you as easily as enemy bullets. By November 1943, the 2nd Rangers shipped to England. They still had 0 days of combat experience. British commandos had been raiding German positions on the French coast since 1940. The commandos knew cliffsides. They knew German defences. They knew how men died trying to climb under fire. The commandos trained Rudder's Rangers on cliffs at Dorset and the Isle of Wight. The Rangers practiced with rocket-fired grappling hooks and rope ladders. The equipment had never been tested for vertical cliff assault under fire. Each Ranger would carry an M1 Garand rifle weighing 9.5 pounds. Each man would carry 2 grenades, 1 canteen, and a D-ration chocolate bar. No heavy weapons in the first wave. No mortars, no machine guns, no bazookas. Just rifles, and the men who carried them. Point du Hoc stood 100 feet above the English Channel. At the base of the cliff was a narrow beach. The beach disappeared at high tide. German defenders occupied concrete bunkers and fighting positions along the cliff edge. They had rifles, machine guns, mortars, and grenades. They had orders to defend the position to the last man. Allied intelligence had photographed Point du Hoc every week since January 1944. The reconnaissance aircraft flew at high altitude and took detailed photos of the German fortifications. The photos showed 6 massive artillery pieces in open concrete gun pits. The guns were French Canon de 155 GPF, captured when France fell in 1940. The Germans designated them 15.5 cm K418F. Each gun weighed over 10,000 pounds. Each could fire a 95-pound shell over 11 miles. The guns were mounted on wheeled carriages that allowed them to be moved. The Germans were building concrete casemates to protect the guns from air attack, but the casemates were not finished by D-Day. General Dwight Eisenhower studied the intelligence photos. He called Point du Hoc the most dangerous battery in France. General Omar Bradley agreed. Bradley called it the most difficult mission he ever assigned. Bradley later wrote that no soldier in his command had been given a harder task than the one that fell to this 34-year-old commander from Texas. On the night of June 5th, Companies D, E, and F of the 2nd Ranger Battalion boarded transport ships in the English Channel. 225 Rangers would assault Point du Hoc. The invasion had been postponed 24 hours due to weather. The sea remained rough on June 6th. Waves ran 6 feet high. Wind blew at 15 miles per hour. The landing craft would have trouble reaching shore. The ropes would be wet from sea spray. Wet ropes were heavier than dry ropes. Wet ropes would not fly as far when launched by rockets. Rudder studied the weather and made no changes to the plan. At 04:45 on June 6th, the Rangers loaded into 9 British landing craft assault. Each craft was 36 feet long, built of wood and steel. Each carried 22 men. The craft were designed for beach landings, not cliff assault, but they were all the Rangers had. The craft departed the transport ship at 0500 hours. The run to Point du Hoc would take 90 minutes. H-hour was set for 0630. The Rangers would land at the same time as the first waves hitting Omaha Beach. Naval gunfire would support the landing. The battleship USS Texas would fire its 14-inch guns at Point du Hoc. The destroyer USS Satterlee would fire its 5-inch guns. The British destroyer HMS Talibont would add its guns to the bombardment. The plan called for the naval guns to fire from 0550 until 0625. Then the guns would cease fire 5 minutes before the Rangers landed. This would give the smoke time to clear so the Rangers could see the cliff face. The plan required precise timing and precise navigation. At 0600 hours, Lommel realized something was wrong. He was in LCA 668, one of 9 landing craft carrying the Rangers toward Point du Hoc. He looked at the cliffs ahead. They did not match the photographs he had studied for 3 weeks. The silhouette was wrong. The gun positions were not visible where they should be. Lommel turned to the British coxswain steering the craft. He shouted over the engine noise. They were heading toward the wrong cliff. The coxswain checked his compass and map. He had steered toward Point de la Percie, 3 miles east of Point du Hoc. The entire flotilla of 9 craft was off course. The navigation error would cost them 40 minutes. Rudder, in the command craft, saw the error at the same time Lommel did. He ordered all craft to turn west immediately. The landing craft turned and began running parallel to the coast. They had to travel 3 miles west to reach Point du Hoc. But the tidal current was running east at 3 knots. The current pushed against them. Speed dropped from 6 knots to 4 knots. They were making barely 1 knot of progress toward the target. The Rangers were now 40 minutes behind schedule. The naval bombardment ended at 0625 as planned. The big guns stopped firing. Smoke drifted across Point du Hoc. The Germans, who had been sheltering in bunkers during the bombardment, emerged and returned to their fighting positions along the cliff edge. They were ready and waiting when the Rangers finally arrived. At 0710, the landing craft approached Point du Hoc. They were 40 minutes late. The element of surprise was gone. German machine guns opened fire from the cliff top. Tracers arced down toward the landing craft. Lommel's craft, LCA 668, grounded 20 feet from shore. The water was deeper than expected. The ramp dropped into chest-deep water. Lommel grabbed a box of ropes in one hand and a rocket launcher in the other. He stepped off the ramp into the cold water. A German machine gun was firing from directly above. The bullets kicked up spray around the landing craft. One bullet hit Lommel in the right side. The impact spun him around. The bullet passed through the flesh without hitting bone or organs. It burned like fire. Lommel kept moving. He pushed through the water toward shore. Other Rangers followed. Some went under and did not come up. Their equipment pulled them down. The box of ropes weighed 20 pounds. The rocket launcher weighed 15 pounds. The Garand rifle weighed 9.5 pounds. The ammunition weighed another 10 pounds. Men were carrying 60 to 80 pounds of equipment in chest-deep water while being shot at. Lommel reached the narrow beach. He dropped the ropes and pressed himself against the cliff base. The cliff overhang provided some protection from grenades being thrown from above. Behind him, other Rangers were struggling through the water. Rudder's craft, LCA 888, touched down at 0712. Rudder stepped into the water and waded ashore. He immediately began directing the assault. His voice carried over the noise of gunfire and explosions. He pointed to positions along the cliff base. He ordered rocket teams to set up their launchers. The rocket teams assembled quickly. The rockets were 4 feet long, mounted on tube launchers. Each rocket had a grappling hook attached to a rope. The ropes were 150 feet long, longer than needed for a 100-foot cliff. The extra length accounted for the angle of fire and the need to have rope to spare if some failed. The rocket teams aimed their launchers toward the cliff top. They fired at 0714. The rockets launched with a whoosh. Smoke trails marked their path. Some ropes reached the cliff top, and the grappling hooks caught on rocks and concrete. Some ropes fell short. The ropes were waterlogged from sea spray during the 90-minute run to shore. They were heavier than in training. They did not fly as far. The rocket teams reloaded and fired again. More ropes reached the top. German soldiers appeared at the cliff edge. They saw the ropes and began cutting them with knives and bayonets. Some ropes fell back down the cliff face. Rangers started climbing before the Germans could cut all the ropes. If they waited, there would be no ropes left to climb. British landing craft carrying extension ladders arrived at 0716. The ladders were borrowed from the London Fire Brigade. They were 100-foot extension ladders designed for fighting fires in tall buildings. The Rangers had mounted them on DUKW amphibious trucks. 3 DUKWs made it to shore. One had capsized in the rough seas and sank with its crew. The DUKWs drove onto the beach. The crews extended the ladders and propped them against the cliff face. Rangers began climbing while Germans threw stick grenades from above. One grenade landed on a ladder 40 feet up. The explosion killed 2 Rangers and knocked the ladder sideways. Other Rangers kept climbing. Lommel climbed a rope on the left side of the beach. The wound in his side burned with every movement. He ignored it. He pulled himself up hand over hand. His boots scraped against the wet chalk cliff face, looking for footholds. There were none. The cliff was nearly vertical. All the weight was on his arms. The rope swayed in the wind. Machine gun fire snapped past his head. Bullets kicked up chalk dust from the cliff face. At 70 feet up, a German soldier appeared at the cliff edge directly above Lommel. The soldier had a stick grenade. He pulled the cord to arm it and threw. Lommel saw the grenade tumbling toward him. He could not dodge. He could not let go. He pressed his body against the cliff and turned his head. The grenade exploded 15 feet to his left. Shrapnel hit the cliff face. Rock fragments peppered his left arm. None of the shrapnel hit him directly. His ears rang from the explosion. He resumed climbing. At 90 feet up, his right hand reached the top of the cliff. He grabbed a rock and pulled. His left hand came up. He found a handhold. He pulled himself over the edge and rolled onto flat ground. He lay on his back for 3 seconds, catching his breath. Then he unslung his Thompson submachine gun and looked around. He was among the first Rangers from D Company to reach the cliff top. Around him, other Rangers were pulling themselves up ropes and ladders. Some were shot as they came over the edge and fell back down. Others made it up and immediately moved inland. The cliff top was chaos. The cliff top looked nothing like the intelligence photographs. Weeks of Allied bombing had turned the area into a moonscape. Bomb craters 30 feet wide and 15 feet deep covered the ground. Some craters overlapped. The ground was churned earth and broken concrete. Landmarks were gone. The carefully memorized maps were useless. Everything looked the same, just craters and rubble. German defenders were falling back but still fighting. Snipers fired from shell holes. Machine guns fired from bunkers 200 yards inland. The Rangers could not advance in formation. They formed small groups of 3 to 5 men and moved from crater to crater. Fire, move, fire, move. They advanced toward where the gun positions should be. Lommel led his squad toward the western gun positions. D Company's objective was to capture gun positions 4, 5, and 6. They ran in short bursts. They dove into craters for cover. They fired at any movement. German soldiers returned fire. Rangers fell. Lommel's squad reached the first gun pit at approximately 0730. The gun pit was a circular concrete structure, 20 feet in diameter, with walls 6 feet thick. The walls were pockmarked from bomb fragments. The pit was open to the sky. Lommel entered through a gap blown in the wall. The pit was empty. No gun, no crew, no ammunition, no shell casings. Just a wooden pole standing upright in the center. The pole was camouflaged with netting and paint to look like a gun barrel from the air, a decoy. Allied reconnaissance aircraft flying at 20,000 feet had photographed this pole, thinking it was a 155mm gun. Lommel moved to the second gun pit 50 yards away. He entered carefully, expecting Germans. The pit was empty. Another wooden pole, Another decoy. He felt sick. The mission was to destroy the guns. If there were no guns at Point du Hoc, where were they? He moved to the third gun pit. Empty. Wooden pole. All 3 gun pits on the western side were empty. The guns had been moved. Lommel gathered his squad. They now numbered 12 men. The rest of D Company was scattered across the cliff top, fighting Germans in the bunkers and craters. Lommel made a decision. The primary mission was to destroy the guns. The guns were not on the cliff top. They had to be somewhere nearby. The Germans would not have moved them far. They were too heavy. Each gun weighed over 10,000 pounds. Moving them required tractors or horses. Lommel told his squad they were moving inland to find the guns. The secondary objective for D Company was to reach the coastal road 400 yards south of the cliff and set up a roadblock. The road ran from Grand Camp in the west to Vierville in the east. German reinforcements would use that road to move between sectors. If the Rangers could block the road, they could prevent German forces from moving east to reinforce the defenders at Omaha Beach. Lommel led his squad south through the craters. They advanced in a staggered line. German snipers fired at them. They fired back and kept moving. It took 20 minutes to cover 400 yards. The terrain was that difficult. They reached the coastal road shortly after 0800 hours. The road was unpaved, just hard-packed dirt. Lommel studied the surface. Fresh tire tracks, multiple tracks from heavy vehicles. Something large had been moved recently. The tracks came from the north, from the direction of Point du Hoc. They led south into an orchard. Lommel turned to Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn. Kuhn was the acting platoon sergeant for the 2nd Platoon. He was 24 years old, from Altoona, Pennsylvania. He had trained with Lommel for 10 months. Lommel trusted him. Lommel told Kuhn to take half the squad and set up positions along the road. Create a roadblock. Stop any German vehicles or troops trying to use the road. Lommel would take the other half and follow the tracks. Kuhn and 6 Rangers took positions in the ditches on both sides of the road. They had clear fields of fire in both directions. Any German vehicle trying to pass would be caught in a crossfire. Lommel and 5 Rangers moved south along the sunken road between high hedgerows. The hedgerows in Normandy were 9 feet tall, thick tangles of earth and roots and bushes. They had been growing for centuries. Tanks could not push through them. Men could barely see over them. The sunken road ran between 2 hedgerows, creating a natural corridor. The tire tracks led down the road. Lommel and his men moved carefully. This was enemy territory. Germans could be anywhere. They advanced by leapfrogging. One man would move forward 20 yards while the others provided cover. Then the next man would move. They covered 200 yards in 10 minutes. The road opened into an orchard. Apple trees, planted in neat rows. The trees were in bloom. White blossoms covered the branches. It would have been beautiful on any other day. Lommel held up his hand. His men stopped. He had seen something. Ahead, under camouflage netting stretched between trees, were artillery pieces. 5 of them. 1 5.5mm guns. The missing battery from Point du Hoc. The guns were positioned in a line, spaced 20 yards apart. They were pointed north toward Utah Beach. The elevation was set. The range was set. Ammunition was stacked beside each gun. Wooden crates marked with German stenciling. Each crate contained shells. Powder charges were in separate crates. The guns were ready to fire. But no crew was visible. Lommel scanned the orchard. Approximately 100 German soldiers were 300 yards away in an adjacent field. They appeared to be assembled for a formation, probably the gun crews and security troops. They had pulled back during the naval bombardment and had not yet returned to their guns. This was the moment. The guns were unguarded. Lommel could destroy them now. If he waited, the crews would return. Then it would be a firefight. 6 Rangers against 100 Germans. Bad odds. Lommel whispered to his men, "Kuhn, you stay here and cover me. Watch those Germans. If they start coming this way, open fire and give me time to get out. The rest of you stay here with Kuhn. I am going in alone." Lommel moved forward in a crouch. He entered the orchard and approached the first gun. It was massive up close. The barrel was 12 feet long. The wheels were 5 feet tall. The gun sat on a wheeled carriage that allowed it to traverse and elevate. Lommel pulled out 2 thermite grenades. Thermite burned at 4,000 degrees Fahrenheit, hot enough to melt steel, hot enough to fuse gears and mechanisms. He unscrewed the cap on the first grenade and placed it in the traverse mechanism of the first gun. The traverse mechanism allowed the gun to swing left and right. Lommel placed the second thermite grenade in the elevation mechanism of the second gun. The elevation mechanism allowed the gun to raise and lower. He pulled the pins on both grenades. Thermite grenades did not explode. They ignited silently and burned intensely. Within seconds, molten metal was flowing through the mechanisms. The gears were fusing together. The guns would never traverse or elevate again. They were permanently disabled. Lommel then took his Thompson submachine gun. He wrapped it in his field jacket to muffle the sound. He used the butt of the gun like a hammer. He smashed the optical sights on all 5 guns. Each gun had a telescopic sight for aiming. The sights were precision instruments. Once smashed, the guns could not be aimed accurately. Even if the Germans repaired the traverse and elevation mechanisms, without sights, the guns were useless. Lommel had been in the battery for less than 10 minutes. He had disabled 2 guns with thermite and smashed the sights on all 5. He moved back to where Kuhn was waiting. The German soldiers in the adjacent field had not moved. They had not heard anything. Lommel told Kuhn they needed more thermite grenades to completely destroy the remaining 3 guns. They moved back toward the coastal road, where the rest of D Company was positioned. Lommel found other rangers and obtained more thermite grenades. He and Kuhn returned to the orchard at approximately 0845. The German gun crews were still absent. Lommel placed thermite grenades on the remaining 3 guns. He pulled the pins and stepped back. The grenades ignited. Molten metal flowed. As Lommel and Kuhn were withdrawing, they heard a massive explosion behind them. They turned and saw a fireball rising from the ammunition stacks. Rangers from E Company had arrived at the battery from a different direction. They had thrown grenades into the ammunition crates. The crates exploded. Shells and powder charges detonated in a chain reaction. The explosion could be heard for miles. The 5 guns at Point du Hoc were destroyed. It was approximately 0900 hours. The primary mission was accomplished. Lommel sent 2 runners back to Rudder's command post to report mission accomplished. The runners reached Rudder at 0915. Rudder was relieved. The guns that could have destroyed the invasion fleet would never fire. Back at the cliff top, Rudder had established his command post in a large bomb crater near the cliff edge. The crater provided protection from German fire. It also gave Rudder a view of the battlefield. He could see his rangers fighting across the cliff top. He could see the channel beyond the cliff. The radios were a problem. Most had gotten wet during the landing. Some worked intermittently. Others did not work at all. Rudder needed to signal the main ranger force offshore. The plan called for the 5th Ranger Battalion and the remaining companies of the 2nd Battalion to follow Force A up the cliffs if Rudder sent a success signal by 0700 hours. Force A had landed at 0710, too late to send the signal on time. Without the signal, the 5th Rangers and Companies A and B of the 2nd Rangers would land at Omaha Beach instead of Point du Hoc. They would have to fight west along the coast if they were going to reinforce Rudder. That would take hours, maybe days. By 0900 hours, Rudder had approximately 90 Rangers combat effective on the cliff top. 15 had been killed or seriously wounded during the climb. The rest were scattered across the position engaging German forces. Ammunition was running low. Each Ranger had started with 80 rounds for his Garand. After 2 hours of fighting, most men were down to 20 or 30 rounds. The Germans were counterattacking. The first major counterattack came at 0930. Approximately 200 German soldiers from the 914 Grenadier Regiment of the 352 Infantry Division attacked from the south. They came through the fields and hedgerows south of the coastal road. The Rangers held positions along the road and in craters across the cliff top. They had no artillery support. They had no air support. The cloud cover was too low for aircraft. They had rifles and grenades and courage. The German attack came in waves. The first wave advanced to within 100 yards of the Ranger positions before Ranger rifle fire stopped them. The Germans took cover and returned fire. Then the second wave advanced. The Rangers fired from cover. They aimed carefully. Ammunition was too precious to waste. They made every shot count. The Germans fell back. By 1100 hours, the first counter-attack was stopped, but it had cost the Rangers. Casualties now numbered 35, killed or seriously wounded. Each Ranger had fewer than 20 rounds remaining for his rifle. The Germans attacked again at 1300 hours. This attack was better coordinated. Approximately 150 German soldiers advanced from the west. They used the bomb craters for cover, moving from crater to crater the same way the Rangers had done. The fighting was close range, sometimes hand-to-hand in the craters when Rangers and Germans ended up in the same hole. The Rangers used their last grenades to break up the attack. By 1400 hours, the second counterattack was repulsed. Casualties now exceeded 50%. Less than 100 Rangers remained combat effective. Rudder was among the wounded. During the afternoon fighting, he was hit twice. A German sniper's bullet struck him in the left leg. The wound was painful but not disabling. He continued directing the defence from his command post. Later, a round from British naval gunfire fell short and exploded near his position. Shrapnel hit him in the right chest and arm. The wounds bled heavily. A medic bandaged them. Rudder refused evacuation. He remained in command. At 1700 hours, the Germans launched a third counterattack, this time from multiple directions, north, south, and west. They were trying to push the Rangers off the cliff top, or force them over the cliff edge. The Rangers contracted their perimeter. They abandoned the most exposed positions and pulled back to craters closer to the cliff edge. They were now defending a perimeter less than 200 yards wide. They had nowhere left to retreat. If they lost these positions, they would be pushed over the cliff. The attack continued until darkness at approximately 2100 hours. The Germans did not break through. The Rangers held. As night fell on June 6th, Rudder counted his effective force. Of 225 Rangers who had landed that morning, 90 were still able to fight. The rest were dead, wounded, or missing. Ammunition was almost exhausted. Food and water were gone. Medical supplies were depleted. The wounded lay in craters without morphine. The Rangers prepared for another German attack at dawn. They knew reinforcements might not arrive in time. During the night, German forces infiltrated the Ranger perimeter. Small firefights erupted in the darkness. Rangers used knives and entrenching tools when they ran out of ammunition. The sound of fighting continued through the night. Occasional gunfire, grenades exploding, men shouting in English and German. At 0300 hours on June 7th, Rudder received a message on one of the few working radios. Elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion had broken through German positions at Omaha Beach and were fighting west along the coast. They were approximately 3 miles from Point du Hoc. They might reach the position by noon if the Germans did not stop them. Rudder passed the word to his Rangers. Hold until noon. Just hold until noon. Dawn came at 0530 on June 7th. The sky was overcast. Rain threatened. At 0600 hours, the Germans attacked again. This attack was the largest yet. Approximately 300 soldiers from the 352 Infantry Division. The attack came from the south with mortar and artillery support. German shells exploded across the cliff top. The Rangers had no artillery to return fire. They had rifles with fewer than 10 rounds per man. They fought from shell craters with limited fields of fire. The German attack pushed them back toward the cliff edge. By 0800 hours, the Ranger perimeter had contracted to less than 150 yards. German forces were within grenade-throwing range of Rudder's command post. At 0900 hours, the German attack paused. The Rangers were out of ammunition. Men were ready to throw rocks if the Germans came again. At 0945, American naval artillery began falling on German positions south and west of Point du Hoc. The destroyer Satterlee had re-established radio communication with the Rangers. The ship's 5-inch guns fired on coordinates provided by Ranger forward observers. The shells screamed overhead and exploded in German positions. The German attack broke under the naval gunfire. German forces pulled back to regroup. The Rangers used the lull to redistribute ammunition. Men collected rounds from the dead and wounded. Each Ranger ended up with 5 to 10 rounds, enough for one more fight. At 1100 hours on June 7th, lead elements of the 5th Ranger Battalion reached the coastal road south of Point du Hoc. 23 Rangers from the 5th had fought through 7 miles of German defences from Omaha Beach. They had taken casualties getting there, but they made it. 23 fresh Rangers with full ammunition loads joined Rudder's force. It was not enough to break the German encirclement, but it was enough to hold longer. The fighting continued through June 7th. German counterattacks came every few hours. The Rangers held their contracted perimeter. Naval gunfire from Satterlee kept German forces from overrunning the position but could not drive them away completely. By nightfall June 7th, approximately 70 Rangers remained combat effective at Point du Hoc. On the morning of June 8th, American forces from the 116th Infantry Regiment of the 1st Infantry Division and the 5th Ranger Battalion launched a coordinated attack from Omaha Beach toward Point du Hoc. They advanced with tank support from the 743 Tank Battalion. The tanks broke through German defensive positions. By noon on June 8th, 2 days after the initial landing, the American relief force reached Point du Hoc. The Rangers were finally relieved. The siege was over. Of the 225 Rangers who had landed at Point du Hoc on June 6th, only 90 were still fit for duty when relief arrived. The 2nd Ranger Battalion suffered casualties across all D-Day operations at Point du Hoc and Omaha Beach. 77 Rangers were killed in action, 152 were wounded, 38 were listed as missing. The casualty rate exceeded 70%. Lieutenant Colonel James Rudder survived his wounds. He was evacuated to England for treatment and recovered. He was awarded the Distinguished Service Cross, the nation's second highest award for valor. The citation praised his extraordinary leadership under fire. General Omar Bradley later wrote that Rudder's performance at Point du Hoc was the finest example of Ranger courage in the entire war. 13 other Rangers received the Distinguished Service Cross for heroism at Point du Hoc. First Sergeant Leonard Lommel received the award for his actions in locating and destroying the German gun battery. Staff Sergeant Jack Kuhn received the Silver Star for providing cover during the gun destruction mission. The 2nd Ranger Battalion received a Presidential Unit citation for its assault on Point du Hoc. The Rangers had accomplished their mission. The 6 French 155mm guns at Point du Hoc never fired on the invasion beaches. 5 guns were destroyed by Lommel and the Rangers. The 6th gun was later found nearby and destroyed by another Ranger patrol. Thousands of American soldiers landed safely on Utah and Omaha beaches because the Rangers climbed those cliffs and destroyed those guns. After Point du Hoc, the 2nd Ranger Battalion was rebuilt with replacement troops. Rudder continued commanding the battalion until December 1944, when he was promoted and given command of the 109 Infantry Regiment of the 28th Infantry Division. The Rangers fought across France, through Belgium, and into Germany. They participated in the Battle of Hurtgen Forest in December 1944. They assaulted Hill 400, a German strongpoint that dominated the Ruhr River Valley. The battle for Hill 400 was as costly as Point du Hoc. Lommel was wounded again during that assault. He took shrapnel in his left arm. He continued fighting until the hill was taken. He was awarded the Silver Star for his actions at Hill 400, though he did not receive the medal until 2007, 63 years after the battle. Lommel survived the war and returned to the United States in December 1945. He attended Rutgers Law School on the GI Bill. He graduated and established a successful legal practice in Toms River, New Jersey. He married Charlotte Ewart in 1946. They had been engaged since 1944. They raised 3 daughters and lived in New Jersey for the rest of their lives. Lommel remained active in Ranger veterans organizations. He attended D-Day anniversary ceremonies at Point du Hoc for 65 years. He returned to the clifftop many times. He stood where he had climbed. He remembered the men who had not come home. Lommel died on March 1, 2011, at his home in Toms River. He was 91 years old. He was buried with full military honors. In 2025, Congress passed legislation naming a Veterans Affairs clinic in Toms River the Leonard G. Bud Lommel VA Clinic. James Rudder returned to Texas after the war. He served as mayor of Brady, Texas, from 1946 to 1952. He was elected Texas Land Commissioner in 1956 and served until 1958. In 1958, he became vice president of Texas A&M University. He became president in 1959. As president, Rudder transformed Texas A&M from a small military college into a major research university. He made membership in the Corps of Cadets voluntary instead of mandatory. He opened enrollment to women in 1963. He led efforts to integrate the campus racially. These changes were controversial among alumni but necessary for the university's growth. Rudder served as president until his death on March 23, 1970. He was 59 years old. He died of a heart attack at his home in College Station, Texas. Rudder Tower, on the Texas A&M campus, is named in his honor. The United States government accepted Pointe du Hoc as an American battle monument in 1979. The French government had maintained the site since 1944, but transferred control to the American Battle Monuments Commission. The site remains today, much as the Rangers left it in June 1944. Bomb craters cover the cliff top. The craters have not been filled in. Visitors can walk among them and see the scale of the bombardment. Destroyed German bunkers and gun pits stand as reminders of the fortifications the Rangers captured. The concrete is pockmarked from bullets and bomb fragments. The cliff face still shows marks where ropes scraped the surface during the assault. Rust stains mark where grappling hooks caught on the rocks. At the cliff edge stands a granite memorial erected by the French government. The memorial is a simple pylon positioned atop a German observation bunker. The pylon is shaped like a ranger dagger thrust into the earth. The inscription is in French and English. It reads, "This battery bombarded the landing beaches and was captured on the morning of 6 June 1944 by troops of 2nd Ranger Battalion United States Army under the command of Lieutenant Colonel James E. Rudder. On June 6, 1984, the 40th anniversary of D-Day, President Ronald Reagan traveled to Pointe du Hoc. He stood at the cliff edge where the Rangers had climbed. Before him sat 62 surviving Rangers from the 2nd Battalion. These men were now in their 60s. They had returned to Normandy to remember their fallen comrades. Reagan gave a speech that honored their sacrifice. He described how the Rangers had climbed under fire. He described how they had held the cliff top for 2 days against overwhelming German forces. He described how they had completed their mission despite casualties that would have broken any other unit. Then Reagan turned and addressed the Rangers directly. "These are the boys of Pointe du Hoc," he said. "These are the men who took the cliffs. These are the champions who helped free a continent. These are the heroes who helped end a war." The assault on Pointe du Hoc remains one of the most daring military operations in history. Before the assault, intelligence officers said the mission was impossible. One officer told Rudder that 3 old women with brooms could keep the Rangers from climbing that cliff. The odds were against success. The Rangers climbed anyway. They climbed under machine gun fire and grenades. They climbed 40 minutes late after the naval bombardment had ended and German defenders had returned to their positions. They climbed knowing most of them would die before reaching the top. They reached the top. They found the guns. They destroyed the guns. They held the cliff against repeated German counterattacks for 2 days until relief arrived. The Rangers did what everyone said could not be done. They did it because their training had prepared them for the impossible. They did it because their commander believed in them, and they believed in him. They did it because retreat was not an option. When you fail at Pointe du Hoc, you die at Pointe du Hoc. The Rangers chose to succeed. Most visitors who see Pointe du Hoc today cannot imagine how anyone climbed those cliffs under fire. Even Rudder, when he returned to Pointe du Hoc 10 years after the war, stood at the base of the cliff with his son and said, "How did we do this? It was crazy then, and it is crazy now. But it was not crazy. It was a calculated risk taken by men who understood what was at stake. If the Rangers failed to destroy the guns at Pointe du Hoc, those guns would fire on the invasion beaches. Thousands of American soldiers would die. The invasion might fail. The liberation of Europe might be delayed or defeated. The Rangers understood the stakes. They climbed the cliff because they had to. The mission at Pointe du Hoc proved that unconventional tactics could succeed when conventional military wisdom said they would fail. The Rangers used equipment that had never been tested in combat. They climbed cliffs that military planners said were unscalable. They fought for 2 days without resupply or reinforcement. They held positions that should have been overrun by superior German forces. The lesson of Pointe du Hoc is not just about climbing cliffs or destroying guns. The lesson is about doing what must be done regardless of the cost. The Rangers knew the mission was nearly impossible. They knew most of them would not survive. They climbed the cliff anyway. That is courage. That is duty. That is what it means to be a Ranger. Today, the United States Army Ranger School teaches every new Ranger about Pointe du Hoc. The assault is studied as a textbook example of leadership under fire, small unit tactics, and mission accomplishment against overwhelming odds. Every Ranger who graduates from Ranger School learns the story of Rudder's Rangers. Every Ranger learns the motto that came from D-Day: Rangers lead the way. The phrase came from Omaha Beach on the morning of June 6, 1944. Brigadier General Norman Cotter was at Dog White Sector watching American forces pinned down by German fire. Men were dying on the beach. The advance had stalled. Cotter saw Rangers from the 5th Battalion preparing to move inland. He recognized their shoulder patch. He shouted above the noise of battle, "Rangers lead the way." The Rangers stood up and advanced. They broke through German defenses and opened a gap for other units to follow. The phrase became the Ranger motto. It appears on the Ranger shoulder scroll. It defines what it means to be a Ranger. Rangers lead the way means Rangers do not wait for others to act. Rangers do not need perfect conditions or overwhelming force. Rangers assess the situation, make a plan, and execute the mission. Rangers do what must be done when it must be done. That is exactly what Rudder's Rangers did at Pointe du Hoc. They led the way up those cliffs when everyone said it could not be done. They led the way in destroying the guns that threatened the invasion. They led the way in showing what American soldiers could accomplish when properly trained, properly led, and given a mission that mattered. If this story moved you the way it moved us, hit that like button right now. Every single like tells YouTube to show this story to more people who need to hear it. Hit subscribe and turn on notifications so you never miss a story. We are rescuing forgotten history from dusty archives every single day. Stories about real soldiers who proved themselves with skill and courage. Real people, real heroism, real history. Drop a comment right now and tell us where you are watching from. Are you in the United States, United Kingdom, Canada, Australia, or somewhere else in the world? Our community stretches across every continent. You are not just a viewer. You are part of keeping these memories alive. Tell us your location. Tell us if someone in your family served in World War II. Tell us if you have been to Pointe du Hoc. Just let us know you are here. Thank you for making sure Leonard Lomel and James Rudder and the boys of Pointe du Hoc are not forgotten. These men climbed a cliff under fire to save thousands of lives. They deserve to be remembered, and you are helping make that happen.